So, okay, that's it for me. Agnieszka is our discussant today. She sort of generously volunteered to discuss the paper, so thanks, Agnieszka. And then we'll have Agnieszka make her comments, and then people can ask questions of her or me.
Okay, so this will be not, fairly short, because I think it would be more fun to have a general discussion. First of all, I think it's great. I love this idea of putting this new data set together because it sounds like a tremendous amount of work. But I think it's a data set that's going to really generate a lot of interesting work in the coming years. So it's great. And I think it's a really interesting topic as well. Just trying to figure out how do we see these technocratic connections, these networks emerging, and what their impact is on the kind of economic policies that are being pursued, especially in these contexts of very weak states or states emerging out of conflict. What are the policy implications of this involvement of IFIs in these contexts? How do this money gets attracted and so forth? And when you presented, when I was reading the paper as well, that the notion that there would be a technocratic advantage, right? That if you have technocratic elites or leaders in these states looking to attract IMF financing, that there would be an advantage to having these people who speak the same language, have the same background, probably know each other personally, have had cocktails together, and so forth. That seemed intuitively. When I read it, I was like, oh yeah, it's interesting that we haven't been talking about this in more detail over the last some years. And so I was really surprised when that technocratic advantage didn't show up in each one. Right? Wow, that's really puzzling. That it only shows up as an advantage when you put in democracies, right? But technocrats, by in and of themselves, don't seem to be all that influential, and that's surprising to me. And so one of the things I was scratching my head over is, why would that be? And these were some really half-baked ideas, but it made me curious because I was looking at the timestamp, right? That it's 46 to 2008, and both the world and IMF changed significantly over the course of that time. Right? IMF before 71, when fixed exchange rates go out the window, is a very different institution, doing very different type of programming than it is later, and it morphs again following the Asian crisis, financial crisis. But the kind of engagement it has with different, I don't even want to call them developing countries in economic crisis, looking for financial support, really morphs. And these are very different periods when IMF is doing very different things. So part of my sort of puzzle was like, I wonder what would happen if you disaggregate it. And I don't know if you have enough data for us to do that job.
Oh, right.
If you did it by to see what the technocratic advantages is in these different categories, right? So not 46 to 2008, but to divide it into periods at least before 71 and after 71, because it's a very different institution. Right? And so that was one sort of question I banged around in my head. Would there be a difference? Maybe not, but it made me curious. It also made me wonder, because it's also a period of going up to the international side of things, right? That you have fourth colonial empires, emergence of a lot of new states. You also have the Cold War, and very different. Not everybody goes to IMF for money. And to what extent the dynamics are different during the Cold War and after the Cold War ends. And to what extent that technocratic advantage would emerge in very different ways once you have the end of the Cold War and you don't have anybody else to go to, pretty much, right? And you have this rise of these neoliberal ideas, and they become much more hegemonic. So those were a couple of questions I see. And I don't know if there would be anything, so I just wanted to get your thoughts
We
on
spent all this time trying to disaggregate it across space, essentially, right? To say sort of certain source countries get the advantages, but we hadn't thought about it disaggregating it across time. It makes complete sense. Right?
Yeah, and World Bank actually goes through these sort of more things
Oh,
as
yeah,
well,
right.
So, so it would be something to look at. just sort of, it's a short paper, so I'm sure there are other reasons for this. I was curious why temporary Security Council membership was used as a proxy, as opposed to other things, military bases, military agreements, other things.
Alliances with the United States.
These sorts of things. And so there's probably a reason, but I was just curious what that was. I was also curious how, I don't know, did you use policy? Assessing the ways of democracy?
We used the Chemu and Gandhi and Freeland claims.
It was probably in the paper.
These three authors who have there are a number of different data sets on whether or not you're democratic, right? And these three authors, Jose Chemu, and Jennifer Gandhi and James Freeland, have a data set in which instead of what Poly does is it gives you a score from -10 to 10, where more is better. And they don't give a numerical score. What they say is you're one of 6 regime types that they define, and then say, are you one of the 6? So we basically took their codings.
Do they, because you have this really interesting, the effective part of states, right?
Yeah,
right. Gaddafi as an example, who doesn't have a formal position, yet controls Gaddafi's real estate.
So
do they have that also in that data set?
We relied on them for that, right? So there are 2 big data sets that identify who the leader of the country is. So we wanted to rely on them rather than having to reinvent them. One of them is Chemu, Gandhi, and Freeland who do this, and they are very careful to differentiate a nominal and the effective head of government. So we don't want to code the Queen of England, right? We wanted to code David Cameron or Tony Blair, right? And they make the point that they use, that we use, because this is what we discovered, is that Muammar Gaddafi was never the effective head of government of Libya, or he was, but only for a couple years just after the coup. And then he said this when the Arab Spring happened. But I'm not the leader of the country. I don't know why people care about me. I'm just a colonel, right? So what they try to do is to basically say who's the effective head of the government. So I don't know what they do for Iran.
Yeah.
Actually, that would be like another interesting case of who is the effective head of government.
So I was just curious because sort of a question. There was the thing that did emerge out of this first phase of the analysis, that there's an advantage to new democracies that it vanishes with age. And here's what kind of how do I explain that? And then just out of curiosity, in terms of future stuff that you guys were doing, I'm wondering if you're going to be also moving beyond just IMF or bank funding and looking at private members or FDI or or is there a technocratic advantage to attracting private members by Ellen and Goldman Sachs?
Yeah,
and
right.
talking together. Does that matter? Also for access to private capital.
So the first part of that, so our sense of that main finding is that, so we've done this also, we didn't include this in the paper or the presentation, but we did this, an early part of this was for only post-Civil War countries. So we presented a paper on this a year ago at GW, and Gabby very quickly pulled together for like 50 post-conflict countries basically. And what we found is that there was a strong effect for post-conflict countries, and that the effect was even stronger for new democracies in post-conflict countries. So we have a sense that it matters, and this is the way I presented it in a way that we don't say in the paper, that it matters for fragile places. Right, so if you think about where leadership has the biggest effect, right? If you have a place that has very really stable institutions, everyone has very clear expectations of how you're going to govern into the future. The identity of the leader matters maybe not very much. Now, in a place where the institutions are incredibly weak and no one knows what the road's looking like into the future, the identity of a leader probably matters quite a bit. And you think about sort of places where there are new democracies, and we can think right now in terms of the Arab Spring, in terms of sort of the third or fourth or wave of democracy we're on now, right? That sort of a lot of times you have, if it wasn't Morsi, right, in Egypt, if it was I don't know, pick a guy who probably was the Minister of Finance at some point and really knew his stuff, and somehow that's how he slipped into power, right? Would the world be reacting differently? Because at that point, the expectation of how Egypt would govern itself economically would totally change with that sort of leader in power. So I think it's that there's a murkiness in very, very new democracies because people don't have rational expectations for how the heck the country's going to be governed economically. So that's our explanation. That sort of it adds clarity, it adds a credibility to commitments that wouldn't otherwise be there given the sort of embryonic nature of institutions. The different dependent variables, yeah, we definitely want to do that. Credit ratings was something that we wanted to do. Sort of private financial flows would be great. Data issues for some of these are a little harder than for others. But yeah, no, we definitely want to expand. So the World Bank as well. Also, just within the IMF, do you get easier conditions? So we have data on the conditions on your IMF loans. And so it may be that you're no more likely to get a loan, but you get better conditions or fewer conditions. So no, there's a lot in terms of the sort of different aspects of the analysis that we hope we'll get to. Let's churn out new papers one after another. So yeah, those are really great questions, Agnieszka. Thank you. So do other people have? I'm sorry, Agnieszka, you?
No.
Did other people have sort of questions, thoughts, concerns?
What about the non-democratic countries?
Yeah, so basically you could take, if we think of sort of four groups of, or so actually say three groups of countries, right? Non-democratic countries, new democratic countries, and old democratic countries. It's the only of those three that it matters for is the new democratic countries.
Right, for the technocratic factor, but what if you do not look at that factor, but just look at whether the non-democratic country get IMF funds along compared to the democratic?
We still get, democratic countries are more likely, even controlling for the stuff that we control for, the democratic countries are more likely to get IMF funds. So that's been something that people have been debating for a while. And I think the way we're coding it may not be actually the best way to get at that particular question. So some people think it doesn't exist and argue that the IMF actually has a preference for countries. This all depends on how IMF agreements are made. They're usually and have historically been made behind closed doors with no monitoring by outsiders. And until only the last, you may know this too, but the last like 5 or 6 years, has the IMF actually made public the text of agreements that it has made with countries. So it's usually it's signed by a finance minister, and whoever the sort of the head of the IMF is, or the head of that section of the IMF is. So there's been an argument for a long time that because the IMF has tended to prefer non-transparency, that the IMF prefers to deal with non-democratic countries. So this is why it's a little bit surprising that we would have that finding. So we haven't really given that a lot of thought, given that our emphasis is on this finding that the IMF tends to prefer democracies, all else equal. So I'm not sure why that would be so actually, but I think other people, Jim Vreeland's work would be the person who he's really, really smart on this stuff and thinking about why the IMF lends to some places and not others.
But why is it surprising that the IMF more likely to lend money to democratic countries?
I don't think it's surprising, but for some, there continues to be a theoretical and empirical debate about what the IMF actually prefers from the politics of the countries that it lends to. And there are some people who think that the IMF actually prefers non-democratic politics, that it makes a lot of things interesting and easier. So Vreeland makes this argument that what democratic leaders do is that they want to make changes to economic policy, and sort of this is what Agnieszka I think was partially referring to earlier, that that they want to make changes to economic policy and they can't. What they do is that they go to the IMF not for the money but for the conditions. They go to the IMF and they say, let's make an agreement. You can give me money, I'll pay it back, that's fine, but what you're going to do is you're going to give me leverage against my legislature.
Please have my hands.
Right, so they go to the legislature and say, look at what the big bad IMF made me do. And the legislature at that point has very little ability to make changes to it because it's an international agreement. So the argument in part has been that part of the reason why the IMF is more likely to lend to democracies is in part this dynamic. that democratic leaders use the IMF as leverage against the other branches of government.
So like for the non-democratic countries, what is the chance that the leader is actually having an economic degree?
Lower. So one of the things that we find is that democracies are more likely to have educated leaders than non-democracies. It's funny actually, because if you think about, I think it was Winston Churchill said sort of if you believe in democracy, go talk to the average voter. But voters do better than military juntas and clerics and single parties and so on, right? Voters do a better job. If we think of better as being having a more educated leader, right? Voters do a better job of choosing these educated leaders than whoever chooses a leader in a non-democracy. That may only be, however, and we haven't thought this all the way through, it may just be that a big majority, or it's not a big majority, but a large proportion of non-democratic countries have been military juntas. And military juntas, then you have a colonel or a general in charge, right? Augusto Pinochet would not count as a technocrat, though he clearly brought in everyone from the University of Chicago to manage the economy when he was the sort of the leader of Chile. But he wasn't a technocrat because he wouldn't count as having a graduate degree because he had a military degree and then spent his time in the military. So it may be that dictatorships have less educated leaders only because they tend to be led by military leaders at points who we're not coding as being as highly educated as, say, Barack Obama, who had a law degree, right? So that may be the problem, and I don't know if we control for that, whether that difference disappears or not. I'm not sure.
Because you don't have a large sample.
No, just that we haven't looked at it yet. If we separate out military juntas from non-military juntas and then democratic countries, I wonder if then that the difference between non-democracies and democracies goes away.
But you're saying that some democracies, even some non-democratic countries, they do this system.
Oh yeah, no, it definitely happens, but what generally is the pattern, and this is part of the reason why we want to drill down more than we have, is that someone like Augusto Pinochet comes into power and has a technocrat in charge of the Minister of Finance and has a technocrat in charge of the central bank. But he himself is not a technocrat.
In that case, would the democracy count?
It wouldn't count in our case because we're only looking at the head of government. So we coded Pinochet. We didn't code Pinochet's government. Now, you can imagine this is incredibly hard, right? Finance ministers shift faster than heads of government, so that is a massive undertaking that we haven't started yet. But that would be what we would want to explore. And just to follow up on that point a little bit more, there's some people who have taken a look at some of this, and they think that ministers of finance really matter. So the central bankers are a lot more likely to have an economics degree than the Department of State or the Minister of Foreign Affairs or something like that. So that's where you stash the economists essentially. Sam?
I don't know to what extent my comment or question will contribute anything significant to the discussion, but I'm trying to look at it the other way around. Where the IMF, instead of the big powers using the IMF to reward their allies, I'm trying to think, what if the IMF went to the big powers and said, hey, this guy's our ally, do we influence the elections in which he's contesting?
Wait, say that again, Sam?
Say for instance, take the case of Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire.
Okay.
Italy is an ally of IMF and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods for that matter.
Sure.
And there's a general belief
Oh, I see.
that, hey, the IMF went to Washington and said, hey, Washington, you have influence in Madrid. You influence the outcome of the results.
Oh, I see. So the IMF coup.
I'm thinking about it the other way around. Sure. Similar thing happened in the case of Cote d'Ivoire.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right, and that's the story essentially that
Yeah.
of Cote d'Ivoire. I mean, as far as I understand it, that's.
If we look at Tijam Kaba history, a similar thing is being said. So whether it's the other way around, whether that's possible, okay, what will it look like?
The argument here has always been that what the United States cares about is its security interests. What we haven't thought through, and this gets back to one of Agnieszka's questions, What we haven't gotten back to is the question of whether the United States' financial interests, right, dictate part of this, right? So, yeah, Sam, I've never thought about that. I don't think it's an unuseful question at all. That's a great question. We haven't thought about that, actually, and it makes a lot of sense that it could happen, right? And if you think about Ellen's campaign, right, so she campaigned on the I'm an economist, I know what I'm doing.
The word knows me, right?
Ellen knows book, right? Yeah, right. So in that sense, then you're right. Sort of that might make some sense. What we would need to do is look for that in the data, which I'm trying to figure out how that would happen. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if you're absolutely right. So that's something for us to look for, I guess. Thanks, Ed. Sorry, Vivian.
My first question is about the economic criteria for countries or peoples or leaders, because I think everybody is looking for the maximization of his profit. And once a leader is an economist, that means he has more chances or has a broader view on how we can maximize his profit. And if IMF and other international organizations also do want to maximize their profit, even if they don't, they give funding and so forth, they also want to reach some goals. If not their goals, the country will make their country and nation's goals, which means both want to maximize their profit, they work together, and then those countries, for example, in the developing countries, they will get funding. That is my first question. The second is, I'm wondering if it's really the fact of having a degree from overseas or the experience itself of being and living overseas. Because we do have degrees, but more than the degree that we have more chances to live and experience and see with our own eyes. For example, if I go back in Burundi, I will have a degree, but I will have something that I cannot measure or say how big achievement I made. And those things are the best to influence my actions when I become a leader or when I have a position.
One of the things that I'm going to go with your second question first, because it's the fresher one in my mind. So I think you're right, and what we're arguing right now is that being, let's say, this sort of person who comes to power has lots of different effects on your performance as a leader. And what you're doing is identifying, I think, one theoretical weakness of the argument right now, which is that one of those tracks is that simply you know people. Or maybe another way of saying it is that if you've lived in the United States for however many years, right, that you have you're like an anthropologist, right? You've picked up, you know how to act like they do, you know how to blend in, right? And in that sense, then, because of that, you can convince people I know how to talk to them. And I think, now that may be separate, related to, but separate from, you have expertise on economics. So what we should be able to do in the long run, and haven't done yet, and I think when we're done with the data collection, we will be able to do this, is to separate those effects out. There are some people who've lived in the United States, or the UK, or Western Europe, but don't have a degree in finance or economics. There's some people who have a degree in economics or finance, but they didn't get it at one of the prestigious European or American universities. We should be able to sort of break out and sort of disaggregate the impacts of those different attributes, and then be able to say which of those attributes is more important. Is it actual expertise, or is it, as you're pointing out, just living abroad and knowing people and understanding the West, essentially, right? Okay, the first question I'm having a little bit more trouble with. I mean, I think the IMF and the World Bank are well known for managing their money actually relatively well. The World Bank makes a lot of money. So the World Banks are very smart in its investments. There's a sense then, and we argue this in a different paper, Irfan and I, that the World Bank is very, very sensitive to not lending money in a bad place. And so I think you're right that sort of what the part of the causal mechanism is that lenders at the IMF or at the World Bank or at private financial firms, as Agnieszka was saying, right, are very worried about not getting their money back. And in that sense, then they're lending because they think they're more likely to get their money back from their people. So I think that's a big. I think you're right about that as well. Yeah.
Well, congratulations. So far, this is very impressive and obviously an important topic. I really appreciate how hard this is, you know, and it just seems very, very difficult. And let me focus on one of the challenges, which I think you've been talking about. You have, obviously, you're focused on certain data, kinds of data, education and the technocratic. Also, kind of, that is intended as an indicator for defining property for something called, which I'll call persona.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so, which is kind of what you're talking about. There's a persona that is developed or known of these leaders, of these technocratic leaders. Now, persona, and you know, and so I want to sort of wonder: is it that they lived following Vinny's point? You know, it includes a lot of things. Education, one of them, clearly. And I'm wondering, maybe beyond this study, maybe more, are there other indicators is not the right word, but other symbols of a, quote, correct persona? Now, correct is not the right word, but you know what I mean, in this context. And I don't know what right word would be. Now, and that's really what we're talking about here. You know, I think you use the word ideology, they have experience, they have shared knowledge, maybe understand the community, and so on. There's something about this persona that's characterizes them by the people, IMF officials. Now, I would be curious following this to just read, I mean, one thing is to do, sorry to change the methodology here, but kind of narrative analysis, discourse analysis of the reasons that the IMF gave. You know, there's obviously the official story, and then there are always tacit stories.
Sure.
You know, and I know that would be another enormous project, but that would maybe show something, and also deal with this fascinating issue about democratic versus non-democratic So I don't know how to frame that, but there's something about a kind of cultural affinity, persona, and it's more than just ideology, as you were suggesting. It is this, it's something. So I'm raising this as a question.
So we're not the only people engaged in this sort of research right now. So I think this is sort of one of the next big waves of research in poli-sci and econ. Sort of the people are trying to look at are sort of disaggregating and taking apart sort of leadership. And one group of people that's actually studying an aspect of what you're asking about, Dan, is this guy Mike Horowitz at Columbia and Alan Stam, who's at the University of Michigan. And
what school was that?
It's cool.
So that's the
very
commuter,
cold.
the commuter college, just down the street from Michigan State.
For kids who couldn't get into Michigan State. So the argument that they're making is that personality type matters. And I don't know how they're doing this actually, but they're going and collecting data on whether leaders were married, whether they had kids,
Well.
whether they had, I mean, they're going into a big chunk, and now this isn't exactly what you're saying,
Yeah,
you're asking about, right?
that's-
But what they're basically, what they're trying to show is whether some leaders are more risk averse than others, or they have sort of more tolerance for making very, very risky decisions. And they're in the middle of a book project on that, actually. I'm
talking about the perception of the IMF on there, and that
Right.
kind of cultural, whatever you want to say, affinity, or they're one of us, they're in our extended community, whatever, share our
So
values.
one of the things that we want to do in the long run of this project, of course, is to actually match the sort of the depth of the quantitative data we have with the depth of qualitative data as well. And so I think doing a sort of a discourse analysis of the kind that you're talking about is something that actually in the long run we really want to do.
But leave me alone now.
Well, no. I mean,
You're smart enough.
No, every question has totally identified something that we're like, oh yeah, we really need to think about that a lot more. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that's something that we want to do a lot more on. I would push back in just one way, right? I don't think it has to be discourse analysis. I don't think it has to be totally qualitative. So the idea that we want to do that may or may not work, may or not be a complete freaking disaster, is to just do interviews at the IMF, but also to do an experiment at the IMF, which would be to give them a hypothetical loan portfolio, and just change nothing other than the identity of the leader.
And then you film them.
Right.
With your secret.
And basically see whether how they rate the portfolio that they read changes on the basis of nothing other than the identity of the leader.
That's good.
And there are ways that then we can sort of control identity in that sense to get at some of the causal mechanisms that say Vinny was asking about. That sort of might be sort of in interesting ways. But I think you're right. I think bringing like really good discourse analysis to bear.
No, I'm not focused on
these issues.
secret analysis, just their side
No, I
of
think
the story and get data somehow.
Now, the other thing we want to do that we've had Charles kind of slowly start on is to code the backgrounds of leaders at IMF. So to go managing director and one level down.
Good.
And then start to see what their backgrounds are, because we've sort of been assuming that the backgrounds of the IMF leaders are constant, right? That they're all Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Chicago. But that may not be true, actually. So to go and do some serious coding of IMF leaders as well, to see whether there's an actual matching. So in other words, can we really say that this leader was at Harvard at the same time as Alan Johnson Sirleaf? Right, so there's some probability they actually know each other. Right, so there are a couple different ways we can get at this, but I think you're right. I think looking at the other end of the social network is going to be really important to identify that systemic community that we think. Hey, Charles.
Sorry, I missed your paper, but and I haven't read it or heard it, but now I have a lot of questions about it. But it has to do with the idea of figuring out who this type of person is, that who's more likely to get assistance. And as I've been hearing the discussion, this idea of the technocratic advantage, I keep going back to sort of an earlier literature that is on conspiracy theories, and that it's all about the Trilateral Commission, where what was it that LaRouche said? It was the drug dealers from the Queen of England, the George Bush, and so on. There's this sort of both right-wing and left-wing conspiracy theories, which are not about degrees, but they're about networks. It's about these secret networks of people who may in fact be swelling crossbones people, which they are largely. But that it's more about these secret cabals. And that the other conspiracy network, conspiracy theory, again, we go from my conspiracy point to a point about, is it education or is it networks that you're really getting at? I think you're maybe getting at, it doesn't matter with your degree, it matters their networks. But I'll give you a counterexample. And that is the School of Americas. Trained by the U.S. military, such great death squad leaders as Roberto D'Abuson, the leader in El Salvador, Montt, the genocide there in was it Guatemala, or Manuel Noriega. They didn't have economic degrees, but in the Cold War time, they had the network you needed, which was a military network. It was a CIA network. It was that network, and that's what led them to be powerful and to get support and become heads of state. Not because it wasn't about economics. And I think it's not about the degree you have, it's about the network, which is partly this idea of, do you live in America? Can you walk the walk? And in the 80s was, can you march the march? Or can you Ellen Johnson Sirleaf needed to pick up the phone and call the World Bank. Noriega needed to be able to pick up the phone and call the Pentagon. because that was the currency at the time. That's where power came from, and influence came from. And so that shifts, but it's not, again, it's not about education, it's about how you get networked in ways that make you politically powerful. Is that what I wanted to say? Oh, and then the final thing, which is much more the data coding thing, but it's related in a sense, is that how much of what you're seeing in terms of this rise of the technocratic advantage is the flip side of the decline of military coups. What you're seeing is far fewer military leaders who don't have economic degrees because they went to Sandhurst and they went to Leavenworth. They got degrees in military institutions, not in economic institutions. And so it's that the decline of military coups as a viable way to power means that the economy is seemingly rise. It really is that decline of military.
Changing the denominator, well, that's not changing the denominator. It's right. So another category is going away.
Right. It's that you have fewer military leaders, and therefore, of course, you have more economic leaders.
Right. And then the data does.
The largest single group of figures has just been taken off the table.
Let's see if I can actually. I don't know if the graph shows this very well. I think this graph could be a little bit more. Sorry. But
well, you did have military in this. The part they're talking
yeah.
about.
So right. Yeah. So there's. I think this is the military leaders here. Am I getting that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oops, I keep doing that. So yeah. So you can see sort of there's sort of a rise in military leaders in between the 60s and 80s, right? And then this corresponds with about what we would expect with the third wave, right? Or the proportion of world leaders that were educated through the military. So it's declined. So it's down to 10% where it used to be sort of 16 or 17%. It looks like.
It's still that high. I thought it dropped further.
Yeah. So well, it could be. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I would think it would come down a little bit farther too. So I guess and Chris, now to think about it this way, right? It looks like, now maybe I'm wrong about this, but if you look at, these are leaders with undergraduate degrees only, right? So these are leaders with only a secondary degree. They've declined over time, right? And leaders with only a primary degree. Here, these are leaders with only an undergraduate degree. So it looks to me in a way is that sort of as the military leaders have come down, the leaders with undergraduate degrees have come up.
Yeah, that's okay.
Right, so I wonder if that's been that transition, whereas it seems like but you're right in the sense that if we sort of take right here, right before at the beginning of the third wave, right, that's when we see the surge in the graduate degree proportion and the decline. But the surge in the graduate degree proportion has total been larger than the decline in military service, right? So I think you may explain part of it. So I think our explanation is something about sort of the zeitgeist, right? And your explanation is just sort of, well,
it's part of the zeitgeist.
Something more prosaic, right? So there are fewer military judges than there used to be, and so Chile is a good example, right? We get Pineda is the president now of Chile, right? So they used to have a military junta, and now they have a guy who's a businessman, right? So yeah, it's a good question. I think there are ways in which we could disaggregate this a little bit better than we have here to sort of really get at exactly that question, because I think you're asking, one of the claims that we want to make is that the profile of the typical world leader has changed. All right, but the question is why? I think we're saying, well, it's something about the zeitgeist, it was of economics are taking over the world, and you're saying, well, actually, it's maybe something not quite that at all. And I think sort of we need to think a little bit more carefully about that for sure. Okay, the education or networks, I think, like Vinny's question, I think this is absolutely a great question. I think the good part, sort of, the part of the way you're asking this is that, and this sort of goes back to a comment Agnieszka made in her comments, is that the nature of the network that matters has changed over time. And so it might have been a very, very different network in 1950 than it is in, obviously in 2010. And I think you're absolutely right. So one of the things that might be interesting for us to do, given that we have data on military networks, is to see whether there was a military advantage, right, in 1960, and then see if that shifted to a technocratic advantage after 1971.
Which I think there was a military advantage in Latin America in the 1960s.
Well, if we don't find that, there's something wrong with the data, right? Because we know that's true. So, yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that these are the sorts of things that we can check and haven't yet, actually. The conspiracy theories, you reminded me, if you've ever seen the movie So I Married an Axe Murderer, where the guys, there's the triumvirate, and it's the talks about the Vatican, the Gettys, the Rothschilds, and Colonel Sanders. who's been putting a chemical in his chicken to make us go crazy. Speaking of conspiracy theorists, right? No, Jagdish Bhagwati, who is no a socialist by any stretch of the imagination, and I wrote a book called In Defense of Globalization. But in that book, and what was that?
I had a meeting with Peter Mandelbaum, and I had a meeting with Bhagwati, and every few minutes he was like, so
It is.
I can't
Good for you.
Every time I hear his name.
We hadn't realized that yet.
Yeah.
You're right. But Bhagwati wrote a book called In Defense of Globalization. He also wrote a book. He wrote a foreign affairs article, and it's also part of this is in the book, where the tagline of the foreign affairs article, I think, was why trade in widgets is different than trade in dollars. And he said that we shouldn't allow, actually, the limit of globalization is international capital controls. That developing countries should have international capital controls. And the reason why they don't is that the IMF is pushing on them to not have them, because it helps the people who are in cahoots with the IMF. And then he said, and he makes this argument that other people have made too, but there are places like that New Left Review, that there is an IMF Treasury Wall Street complex. That these people all know each other, that they go to the same place. And basically, if you look at the careers of a lot of these people, they work on Wall Street, they work at the IMF, they work in their home countries, they go back to the IMF, they work on Wall Street, they work in Treasury, and so on. It's a cabal of people. So it's not, actually, the conspiracy thing isn't that far away. I think we mentioned that article in the paper at some point, but I didn't mention the presentation. So there are people who make exactly this argument, that there's a cabal of people who all know each other, and they have particular policy preferences, and they're trying to enforce it. And the S-car cabal?
The S-car, we gotta get our place.
I think we just have to call it the Rubenstein.
Jay has a question. Jay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Some of your questions have been answered because I had to step out. So I had one question that's primarily around your method, which is how did you determine the 7 years, and does this maybe relate to some of the changes that the ministry was talking about? Because I can't see the graphs or the kind of backwards relations that Sam was talking about. It's sort of an IMF coup towards things. And then another question was, how did you define fragile places? And my question about that is, if you're trying to make a comment regarding the kind of the neoliberal turn and the kind of the critique of neoliberalism, perhaps, there's a lot of work, and I'm thinking of Stuart Hall's latest piece about humans, like the borders of these countries, and the term itself is itself a neoliberal term. And so how do you justify the recursive critique of the self in that sort of way? And then the final one is, what is the, as far as conflict resolution goes, what is the sort of intervention component that comes out of this research?
Sorry, Jay, I'm still writing all of this down. Okay, so there's 3 questions. How do we identify the 7 years? There are a bunch of different data sets on democracy, and we use one of them that basically codes it kind of dichotomously, well, not quite dichotomously, but basically says you're a democracy or you're not. You may need a different form of democracy or a different form of non-democracy, but you're a democracy or not. And then counts the age of the regime. And so that's how we did that. So basically we were able to code the age of the regime, what kind of regime you are, and the age of that regime for every year, for all the countries in essentially in our data set. So that's how we
naturally the 7 years new democracy.
So statistically, what we did is to let the data tell us where that cut point was, and that's where it was. And the technical thing is we did an interaction term and then calculated the statistical significance of the effect. And where it stops being a statistically significant effect is at about 7 years. We could code that in a couple of different ways, but given the state of the project, we just decided let's let the data tell us. And so that's how we came to that, Jay. The fragile places, I agree with you about the sort of discursive problems here. And Terrence and I in our class had Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart's book on fixing failed states, and sort of a lot of people brought up that same problem. I don't know Stuart Hall's work very well, but sort of we haven't made that a part of the statistical part yet. Sort of what we generally argued is in the paper is that sort of it's places. What we mean by fragile, and I think I agree with you that it's not the right word to use, is that it's not places that are fragile. What we're talking about is places where government state institutions don't create a sense of stability in expectations about what policies are going to be, right? So in, say, Liberia, right, there's an election that's happening, and people had the sense that who won the election had a major effect on where economic policy making would go in the future. People weren't sure what sorts of policies Liberia would have. So what we mean by fragile is, in some places, there's a clear expectation about what the sorts of economic policies will exist, and in other places there aren't. What we mean by fragile in this sense is that there aren't good expectations for what economic policy making will be. And so when you have this sort of leader, it clarifies that ambiguity. And then as to the third question, the intervention component, I'm gonna controversially say that there isn't any, and we don't care to have one. To be perfectly frank, I don't think every paper needs to have an intervention component. Amartya Sen said this, and I'm sort of with Amartya Sen on it because, well, he's a lot smarter than me. But he said, I want to put my ideas in the public sphere, but I've never endeavored to influence politicians. It's a game that I just don't want to play. I have ideas, I put them in the public sphere, and I let people debate those ideas as they wish. And I'm going to be with Amartya Sen on this one. I'm not entirely sure we have a set of ideas that we think involve a significant critique about the way we do world politics. And by we, I mean the West, I suppose. But I don't, other than sort of talking about it with lots of people, I don't have a strong sense of how we would intervene to do something about this, other than to make people aware that these dynamics exist.
Okay, can I guess maybe ask that, and you don't have to answer that.
No, I mean, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. So I think what we're concentrating on right now is to produce very good research. Because if we don't produce really good research, then it's all a moot point for us, right? So any hopes and dreams I have normatively for this project flow from the idea that I'm going to do good research first. Because if not, then I'm just another guy with an opinion. And there are lots of smart people with opinions. And I sort of endeavor to be a little bit more than that, I guess. So to my mind, the research has to come first. And then yes, I think assuming that, and it's a big if, right? But assuming that we're right, that we conduct an excellent research project, and that it can be published in places where people of influence will read it, then yeah, I do have hopes that it will help to dismantle a set of policies and a set of interventions by places like the IMF that I think are very negative for developing countries. But to my mind, that is way down the road. We haven't finished so many things first, and I can make that argument now, and I would have the hunch that I'm right. But I'm doubting Thomas, right? I want to have the research first before I go and make the more normative claim that flows from that research.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. Okay. Everyone's asked a question, so unless people have more questions, I think we're all done. So thanks a lot, Jay, for telecommuting, and thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. And I'll see everyone next year. And I'll see everyone soon.
Thanks for the series, guys.